Imagine a world where the fastest computer wasn't a machine, but a man. A man who was bought and sold, treated as property, yet possessed a mind so powerful it defied comprehension. This is the true story of Thomas Fuller, known simply as Negro Tom. Born into slavery in 1710, with no formal education, unable to read or write, he could solve complex math problems in his head faster than the most educated scholars of his day could do on paper. He could calculate the number of seconds in a century, the grains in a vast bushel of wheat, or the exact age of anyone in months, weeks, and days in a matter of seconds. They called him an anomaly. They called him a miracle. But he was a man, enslaved in colonial America, whose genius was a stark, undeniable testament to the human mind's limitless potential, even when bound by the chains of bondage. Get ready to have your understanding of history, humanity, and raw intellect completely redefined. This is the story of the Virginia calculator. The year was 1710, a time when the soil of colonial America was less a foundation for freedom and more a cage for millions. In a simple, rough-hewn slave quarter on a plantation near Alexandria, Virginia, a boy named Thomas was born. The world he entered was one of brutal labor, harsh sunlight, and the ever-present shadow of his master's will. For Thomas, or Tom, as he was soon called, the day began before dawn and ended long after the stars came out, filled with the back-breaking work of the fields. Education was a privilege reserved for the wealthy and the white. For the enslaved, it was often forbidden, a dangerous key to freedom. Tom never learned to read a single word, nor did he ever write a letter. His world was illiterate, yet his mind was already a library, a calculating engine of unimaginable power, waiting for its fuel. Unlike the other children, Tom didn't just look at the world, he quantified it. While they might see a field, Tom saw acres. While they saw a pile of wood, he saw board feet. The rhythms of the plantation, the daily tasks, the measurements of the harvest, all were raw data for the processing unit. That was his brain. He was quiet, often withdrawn, not from sadness, but from intense internal focus. He'd listen to the overseer rattling off numbers for yield or inventory and instantly, silently, correct him, sometimes to the overseer's bewildered frustration. He wasn't trying to be defiant. He simply could not abide an incorrect number. The numbers just fit a certain way in his head, interlocking like gears in a perfect machine. The earliest signs of his gift were subtle, almost dismissed as childlike oddities. The counting of stars visible from his palette, the precise tally of livestock, the uncanny ability to estimate the time of day just by the angle of the sun and the length of a shadow. When he was older, working in the stables, he learned how many pounds of feed were needed for 30 horses over a week and a half, factoring in their different weights and work levels, a problem that would stump a local farmer with his pen and paper. His fellow enslaved workers noticed it first. They would joke, but with an underlying reverence, calling him the figure man. They'd test him with simple sums, then more complicated ones. Always, without hesitation, he would answer correctly. They would watch him work, his hands moving with the steady, practiced rhythm of a field hand, yet his eyes held a distant, searching look, as if he were scanning an invisible ledger. They didn't understand how he did it. They just knew he could. And in a world designed to diminish and dehumanize them, this quiet, undeniable genius, this raw, God-given power, became a source of quiet awe and pride in the shadowed corners of the slave quarters. It was a secret, a treasure that belonged to them, a phenomenon that existed outside the control of their masters. But secrets on a plantation rarely stay buried forever. Thomas Fuller's extraordinary gift was about to step out of the shadows and into the glaring, astonished light of colonial society. As Thomas grew into a man, his reputation, though whispered and often distorted, began to spread beyond the plantation's boundaries. Stories travel on the currents of human curiosity, and a story about an enslaved man who could perform feats of arithmetic beyond the capacity of educated white gentlemen was too fascinating, and perhaps too inconvenient, to ignore. The anecdotes began small, a farmer in the local tavern claiming that Negro Tom had instantly calculated the interest on a loan for him. A bewildered merchant admitting Tom had caught a substantial error in his complex inventory count, a figure involving dozens of variables. The descriptions of him were always the same: a man of great physical strength, typical of a field hand, but with a gaze that suggested a powerful, ceaseless internal activity. The white community's reaction was a complicated mix of disbelief, wonder, and a deep-seated discomfort. In colonial society, intellectual superiority was considered an exclusive province, a fundamental justification for the hierarchy that placed them atop the enslaved. The existence of a man who shattered this intellectual ceiling, a man who was, by their own laws, less than human, was a profound challenge to their worldview. Some dismissed the stories as exaggeration, folklore, or trickery. Others, the more curious and intellectually open-minded, saw a chance to witness something truly extraordinary. They began to seek him out. His master, an average man who recognized the unusual nature of his property but probably never fully grasped the extent of the genius, found Thomas's gift had a certain utility. It was a talking point, a curiosity, a valuable asset to display to guests, though one that always required careful handling. Imagine the scene: the master hosting a dinner party, the wine flowing, the conversation turning to the marvels of the age, and then, with a flourish, he calls for Tom. Thomas Fuller, the enslaved laborer, would walk into the dining room, cap in hand, surrounded by the wealthy, the educated, the influential men and women of Virginia. The tests they subjected him to were designed to be impossible for an ordinary mind to solve without tools and time. A gentleman might scribble a problem on a piece of paper, a long string of numbers to be multiplied, or a convoluted calculation involving time and distance, and then read it aloud, challenging Tom to solve it before the gentleman's own pocket watch ticked away a single minute. The room would fall silent, all eyes on the quiet, powerful figure in the center. Tom would stand there, his head bowed slightly, listening to the numbers, which for him weren't abstract symbols but concrete quantities he could manipulate like physical objects in his mind. The seconds would tick by, the educated men nervously glancing at their paper, their quills motionless. And then, Thomas would speak, his voice calm and certain, delivering the exact, correct answer. The effect was always the same: a stunned, bewildered silence, followed by a burst of amazed chatter. The Virginia calculator was born. The year was 1789. The colonies had fought a war for independence, becoming the United States. Yet for Thomas Fuller and millions like him, the fight for personal freedom remained an unfulfilled dream. By this time, Thomas was an old man, nearly 80 years old. He had spent his entire life in servitude, his body weathered and worn by decades of labor. But his mind remained sharp, perhaps even sharper than in his youth. The stories of Negro Tom, the calculating prodigy, had finally crossed the invisible line from local legend to a phenomenon worthy of scientific inquiry. The world of 18th-century science and philosophy was obsessed with cataloging and understanding human ability. They sought to understand genius, and here, in the American South, was a true, living anomaly. His fame eventually reached two respected Pennsylvania gentlemen, William Hartshorne and Dr. Benjamin Rush. Hartshorne was a Quaker merchant and abolitionist, and Rush was one of the most distinguished physicians and intellectuals in the country, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a tireless advocate for social reforms. They were drawn by a mix of curiosity, intellectual rigor, and perhaps a desire to prove a point about the capabilities of the enslaved. They traveled to the plantation in Virginia specifically to meet and test this man. Imagine the gravitas of this meeting. Two of the most educated men in the new nation standing face to face with an elderly, enslaved man who had never seen the inside of a schoolhouse. Their intent was not to ridicule or trick him, but to conduct a serious, documented assessment of his mental faculties. They brought their own meticulously prepared problems, the kind that required time and careful work with a pen and paper. This was not a tavern trick. It was a scientific challenge. Their first test was an exercise in pure conversion and multiplication, designed to be complicated and lengthy. How many seconds are in a year and a half? The two scholars, notebook in hand, began to set up the problem. Thomas, meanwhile, closed his eyes, his lips moving almost imperceptibly as he worked through the calculation. The process was purely internal, a high-speed engine of numbers churning within his skull. He converted the year and a half into days, the days into hours, the hours into minutes, and the minutes into seconds, all in one unbroken chain of mental arithmetic. Before the scholars had finished even setting up the correct steps on their paper, Thomas opened his eyes and delivered the answer: 47,304,000. Hartshorne and Rush immediately checked their own calculations, which they performed with great care and precision. The result was perfect. Stunned, they moved to their next question, making it even more complex, incorporating various units of time. Suppose a man has been alive for 70 years, 17 days, and 12 hours. How many seconds has he been alive in that entire time? They waited, their anticipation palpable. Again, Thomas closed his eyes. The clock on the wall seemed to slow down. He had to account for 17 leap years within the 70-year span, a detail many educated people forget. After a noticeably longer period of intense concentration, Thomas spoke. 2,210,500,800. They rechecked their figures, calculating and recalculating the leap year adjustments. The answer was once again completely and perfectly accurate. Thomas Fuller had just bested two of the greatest minds in America, using only the power of his memory and his own unique mathematical methods. The legend was real, and the scholars left the plantation with documented, undeniable proof of a genius that slavery could contain, but never truly erase. The visit from the Philadelphia scholars, Hartshorne and Rush, was a turning point. Their detailed, written accounts of Thomas Fuller's abilities circulated among intellectual circles, confirming the incredible nature of his mind. But the scholars were not just there to test his capacity for numbers. They were keen observers of the man himself, trying to understand the nature of his extraordinary gift. They noted his physical appearance, strong, elderly, and his demeanor, quiet, humble, and completely unpretentious about his powers. Thomas never boasted. He simply answered the question put to him. For him, the numbers were a natural language, not a performance. Yet, during the intense testing session, the scholars noticed something peculiar, a subtle flaw, if you could call it that, in his method. When they presented him with the problem of calculating the seconds in 70 years, 17 days, and 12 hours, he delivered the correct number, 2,210,500,800. But one of the scholars, fascinated by his process, asked Thomas a follow-up question, trying to catch him out. How many seconds are in that time if you exclude the hours? Thomas paused, his brow furrowing slightly, and he took a few extra moments before responding. His answer was also correct. However, Dr. Rush and Mr. Hartshorne observed that Thomas seemed to struggle more with the subtraction than he did with the initial, much larger and more complex multiplication. He appeared to find the subsequent adjustment, the simple act of taking away a smaller number from the enormous total he had just calculated, more difficult and time-consuming than performing the original calculation from scratch. This observation led the scholars to a crucial insight into Thomas's mind. His genius wasn't just raw computational speed. It was a deeply ingrained, almost intuitive method of cumulative calculation. Thomas's process was not about breaking the problem down into small, manageable steps and then following a conventional algorithm. Instead, he seemed to visualize the entire problem as a massive, single entity and build the final number up piece by piece, like constructing a towering digital edifice in his mind. Once the total was established, the process of undoing a part of it, of subtracting a unit, was foreign to his method. It was as if he had built a magnificent sandcastle and was then asked to remove one turret. It was easier for him to simply build the whole castle again with the required modification than to carefully dismantle the single piece. This finding was actually a profound compliment to his brain's efficiency. It suggested that Thomas Fuller had developed a completely unique, streamlined system of mathematics, a personal calculus, that made the shortest distance between a question and its answer a straight, uninterrupted line of multiplication and addition. He wasn't following the rules taught in universities. He was writing his own rules, ones that were impossibly fast and perfectly accurate. The existence of Thomas Fuller forced the most prominent intellectuals of the 18th century to confront difficult questions about the nature of intellect and race. At the time, the prevailing, utterly wrong-headed scientific theories were often used to justify slavery, asserting that people of African descent were inherently intellectually inferior. Thomas Fuller stood as a living, undeniable refutation of this cruel doctrine. His mind was not just equal, it was superior to many of the men who claimed to own him. Dr. Benjamin Rush, a man of Enlightenment ideals, was deeply affected by his encounter with Thomas. He used the account of the Virginia calculator not merely as a curiosity, but as an empirical tool in his broader campaign against slavery. Rush and others like him argued that Thomas Fuller's extraordinary gift proved that intellectual capability had nothing to do with skin color. If a man, denied all education, subjected to brutal labor since childhood, could develop a mental capacity that astonished the educated world, what potential was being brutally suppressed in the millions of others held in bondage? The case of Thomas Fuller became a quiet, powerful weapon in the early abolitionist movement. It forced observers to consider that genius could bloom anywhere, regardless of environment or ancestry, and that the only thing holding back the enslaved population was the institution of slavery itself. His story provided concrete, mathematical proof that human potential was universal. However, the dominant culture struggled to reconcile his genius with their deeply held prejudices. Faced with undeniable proof, they often resorted to trying to find other, less threatening explanations for his power. Some speculated he was not truly calculating, but possessed a kind of freakish, specialized memory, that he had simply memorized huge tables of numbers and could rapidly cross-reference them. This explanation was quickly dismissed by the complexity and originality of the problems posed to him, problems that required true, dynamic arithmetic, not rote recall. Others suggested he had a kind of innate, animal-like intuition, separating his abilities from true human reason and intellect, a desperate attempt to maintain the racial hierarchy. They tried to frame his ability as a kind of savant skill, narrow and purely mechanical, rather than recognizing it as the vast, sophisticated intelligence that it was. Thomas, meanwhile, was oblivious to the philosophical and political storm his mind was creating. He simply continued to do his work, and when asked, he continued to answer with flawless numbers, letting his intellect speak for itself and quietly dismantle the foundations of colonial prejudice, one astonishing calculation at a time. His mind was a quiet, relentless force working against the very system that had stolen his life. Thomas Fuller lived to an extraordinary age for the time, especially considering the harshness of his life as an enslaved person. He passed away in 1790 at the age of 80. His death, quiet and simple on the same plantation where he had been born, brought an end to the living miracle, but his story was far from over. The accounts published by Hartshorne and Rush ensured that the phenomenon of the Virginia calculator was recorded for posterity. His name, Thomas Fuller, became permanently attached to the scientific record of the age, an undeniable footnote in the history of mathematics and human intellect. It's important to remember that Thomas Fuller lived and died before the concept of a calculator was even a machine. He was the embodiment of the term. He was an organic, self-taught computational device. His legacy is not just one of mathematical genius, but one of profound historical significance. In the 18th century, a time characterized by brutal oppression and systemic intellectual denial, Thomas Fuller provided irrefutable proof of the suppressed genius within the enslaved population. His story became a cornerstone argument used by early American abolitionists. Whenever pro-slavery arguments leaned on the supposed lesser intelligence of African people, the abolitionists could simply cite the meticulously documented facts about Thomas Fuller, a man who, without ever learning the alphabet, could outperform the best educated men of Philadelphia. While there are no known images or detailed biographies of Thomas Fuller, the fact that his story was recorded and published at all is a testament to the sheer power of his ability. It was an ability so extraordinary that it demanded documentation, overriding the prevailing racist impulse to ignore or suppress evidence of Black intellect. His existence forced a crack in the wall of prejudice, demonstrating that genius is colorblind, and that the greatest tragedy of slavery was not just the physical suffering, but the immense, incalculable loss of human potential. The philosophers, scientists, artists, and leaders whose brilliance was extinguished by bondage. Thomas Fuller's legacy is a quiet, yet deafening, mathematical protest. He was a man whose life was owned by another, but whose mind remained fiercely and beautifully his own. The only place he was truly free was within the infinite landscape of numbers, and it was in that internal, boundless universe that he achieved his lasting freedom and left a permanent mark on the history of American thought. To truly appreciate Thomas Fuller's calculations, we need to try and grasp how he did it without paper or counting aids. Since he couldn't write, he couldn't store intermediate figures outside of his consciousness. This means his mind was not just a calculator. It was a vast, perfectly organized memory palace, capable of holding and manipulating multiple colossal numbers simultaneously. Imagine a massive, multi-layered whiteboard in your head, where every number is written down in a unique format that only you understand, and you can erase and rewrite sections instantaneously. Conventional arithmetic, even for educated people in the 18th century, was a slow, deliberate process of setting down digits, carrying over figures, and meticulously checking columns. For a problem like multiplying millions by thousands, the paper itself would quickly fill up. Thomas Fuller, however, had developed an intuitive, non-visual method. It is highly likely that he wasn't visualizing the Arabic numerals 0, 1, 2, 3 at all, since he was illiterate. Instead, he likely worked with the actual quantities the numbers represented. Imagine trying to calculate the total number of grains in 50 bushels. Most people would write down 50 times grains per bushel. Thomas, however, might have conceived of the entire quantity as a massive, tangible pile and could manipulate the dimensions of that pile in his head. When calculating the seconds in 70 years, he wasn't just performing multiplication. He was conceptualizing time itself, the passage of days, the rotation of the Earth, the accumulation of weeks, and expressing that concept in a perfect numerical total. This suggests that his brain might have used a unique, possibly rhythmic or structural method of storage. It is believed that many self-taught calculators develop a way to assign properties, like color, texture, or sound, to digits to help them remember and manipulate the long strings of figures. For Thomas, the numbers may have flowed with the steady rhythm of the planting and harvesting seasons, or the tireless pulse of the river near his plantation. His mind was constantly working, creating patterns and systems from the chaos of raw data. The rhythm of his daily labor, the repetitive, cyclical nature of field work, may have subconsciously provided the perfect framework for his computational system, a steady beat against which the millions and billions of units could be counted, organized, and perfectly placed. It was a mathematical language known only to him, a secret dialect spoken only in the chambers of his own brilliant mind. While Thomas Fuller's intellectual feats brought him brief moments of attention from the educated elite, it is crucial to remember the painful irony of his situation. He was a genius in chains. His mental life was a soaring universe of perfect logic and infinite calculation, yet his physical life was confined to the drudgery of a slave plantation. His mind was a treasure, but his body was property. Imagine the frustration of such a mind, constantly processing, calculating, and solving, yet being forced to spend decades on tasks that required only brute strength and repetitive action. Every day, Thomas was compelled to labor in fields where the only numbers that mattered to his master were the number of rows plowed or the number of barrels filled. He could calculate the circumference of the earth, yet he couldn't choose where his feet would stand tomorrow. The accounts of Hartshorne and Rush offer only a brief snapshot of his life in 1789. We know almost nothing of his emotional life, his relationships, or his personal dreams. Did his intellectual gift bring him solace, a private world where the misery of his reality could not penetrate? Or did it deepen his suffering, making him keenly aware of the vast gap between his potential and his enforced limitations? It is likely a mix of both. The power of his mind must have been an internal source of dignity. In a system designed to strip away self-worth, Thomas possessed an ability that no master could take away, sell, or diminish. His genius was his own, an internal, unassailable freedom. But it must have also been a constant, burning reminder of the life he was denied. He could have been a professor, an astronomer, an engineer, a surveyor, any of the learned professions that relied on the kind of mathematical power he possessed. Instead, he was a laborer, forever separated from the intellectual community that would have celebrated and utilized his extraordinary talent in any other circumstance. The weight of his unrecognized talent, the vast, untapped potential of a mind built for the cosmos, trapped in a life designed for the dirt, must have been an unbearable burden, a silent tragedy played out over 80 years. To fully appreciate Thomas Fuller, we need to understand the state of mathematics in colonial America in the 1700s. While Europe was experiencing the Enlightenment and advances in calculus, American colonists were generally focused on practical, applied mathematics, surveying land, calculating trade duties, managing currency exchange, and basic business arithmetic. The kind of problems Thomas was solving, complex conversions of time over decades, involving leap years and multiple units, were considered difficult and time-consuming even for men who had studied at colleges like Harvard or William and Mary. Mathematical tools were also primitive. The pocket watch was a luxury, and mechanical calculators were purely theoretical concepts, not yet practical devices. People relied on slide rules, logarithmic tables, and often, simple counting beads or their fingers. The standard arithmetic teaching often involved rote memorization and manual calculation. The speed and accuracy displayed by Thomas Fuller, who used none of these external aids, was therefore not just impressive. It was scientifically baffling to the observers. When Hartshorne and Rush traveled to Virginia, they were not minor figures. They represented the height of colonial American intellectualism. For them to meticulously document and vouch for Thomas's abilities elevated his story from mere folklore to established scientific fact. This wasn't just a smart field worker. This was a man whose mental calculation ability was fundamentally different from anything the educated world had previously encountered. His method, the swift, uninterrupted delivery of the final answer, was contrary to the slow, step-by-step methods taught in schools. It suggested a parallel processing capability, where multiple complex stages of the calculation occurred simultaneously in his mind. In an age where even the most dedicated scholars were still grappling with the practical application of logarithms and early statistics, Thomas Fuller was performing feats of mental acrobatics that prefigured the speed and efficiency of modern electronic computation. His brain was running an internal operating system centuries ahead of its time, making him a true, self-created pioneer in the art of human calculation. His talent was not just rare, it was functionally revolutionary. While the time conversion questions were impressive, the most famous mathematical tests Thomas Fuller faced often involved concepts related to his daily life, large quantities of tangible items. One such classic problem that circulated in the accounts of the Virginia calculator was a multi-step problem involving a harvest. If a man has 40 bushels of corn, and each bushel contains 8,000 grains, and he sells it all at a price of 2 shillings per 1,000 grains, how much money does he make? For most people, even educated ones, this problem requires several steps and involves dealing with large numbers and converting units of currency. First, you calculate the total number of grains, 40 by 8,000, which gives 320,000 grains. Then, you determine how many thousands of grains that equals. 320,000 divided by 1,000 is equal to 320. Finally, you multiply that number by the price per thousand, 320 by 2 shillings, resulting in 640 shillings. Thomas Fuller, however, would have solved this without mentally breaking it into these neat, separate steps. Instead, he probably saw the entire process as one fluid chain of ratios and multiplications. He didn't see 320,000. He saw the total quantity of 40 bushels being converted in a continuous mental flow directly into its value in shillings. This continuous calculation is what granted him his extraordinary speed. He wasn't solving equations. He was performing instantaneous, perfect mental commerce. The sheer volume of the numbers was usually enough to trip up the gentleman testing him, who often made errors in carrying or transposing the figures. But for Thomas, the number 320,000 was simply a larger version of the number 32. The scale didn't inhibit him. He had a deep, internal understanding of place value and multiplication that was impervious to the common mistakes of written calculation. His mind treated the numbers not as arbitrary symbols on a page, but as inherent, fundamental truths. The numbers existed in his head, unblemished by ink blots or accidental erasures, and they always behaved exactly as they should. This perfect reliability was the essence of his genius, allowing him to solve problems related to currency, land area, or weight with the same startling speed and precision. The published accounts of Thomas Fuller, though scarce, generated a significant, though regionally limited, public reaction. In a time when newspapers were a primary source of intellectual exchange, his story was a sensational item. People loved the idea of a natural, self-taught genius, especially one who could humble the educated elite. However, the astonishment was often laced with the era's deep-seated skepticism and racism. For the average citizen, the idea that a man who couldn't read or write could solve such colossal problems was nearly impossible to grasp. This led to persistent rumors and counter-explanations. Some claimed he was being fed the answers by an educated co-conspirator. Others believed his ability was the result of a pact with the devil, an ancient superstition used to explain any phenomenal skill that defied ordinary understanding. These fantastical explanations were often preferred over the simple, powerful truth that intellect is universal and unbound by education or race. The most damaging and pervasive response, however, was the tendency to simply attribute his skill to a kind of freak of nature, a singular, unrepeatable accident. By isolating Thomas as an anomaly, the public and the intellectual community could avoid the logical conclusion his existence demanded, that if Thomas Fuller, raised in slavery, could possess such a mind, then countless other enslaved people must possess significant, suppressed intellectual potential. This framing of his genius as a one-off, biological quirk allowed people to admire his ability without challenging the oppressive system that defined his life. Thomas became a fascinating exhibit, a marvel of human memory, but not a symbol of human equality. This intellectual distance was a defense mechanism for a society dependent on slavery. By making him a marvel rather than a man, they avoided having to confront the moral implications of his brilliance. His greatest triumph, his undeniable mental power, was, in a tragic irony, also minimized by the very society that felt compelled to document it. Thomas Fuller, the Virginia calculator, was not the only calculating prodigy recorded in history, but his context and age make him unique. Many famous calculating savants, like Zira Colburn or Jedediah Buxton, emerged as children or young men. Their speed was often attributed to a youthful brain's plasticity and capacity for pattern recognition. Thomas, however, performed his most documented, astonishing feats when he was nearly 80 years old. Most people experience some form of cognitive slowdown as they age. Memory and processing speed often decrease. For Thomas Fuller to be solving multi-billion figure calculations with perfect accuracy in his late 70s and turning 80 is perhaps the most incredible aspect of his story. It suggests that his method was not merely a trick of youth or a temporary burst of savant memory, but a deeply ingrained, highly optimized neural architecture that became more refined, not less, over decades of constant, internal practice. His advanced age when he was tested provides powerful evidence that his mathematical gift was robust and permanent. Unlike younger prodigies whose skills sometimes faded or were replaced by traditional, slower learning methods, Thomas's ability remained his only computational tool. For 80 years, his brain had been performing these calculations day in and day out, in the fields, in the slave quarters, making it an incredibly durable and efficient system. Furthermore, Thomas lacked the context many other prodigies benefited from. Jedediah Buxton, an English contemporary, was poor but was free, was educated enough to read and write, and was even brought to London to demonstrate his skills. Thomas Fuller had none of those advantages. His brilliance survived not because it was nurtured, but because it was simply too powerful to be extinguished by the surrounding environment. His elderly mind, sharp as a diamond and faster than any machine of his era, stands as a testament to lifelong intellectual power and the resilience of the human spirit. Where did this monumental ability come from? Since Thomas Fuller was illiterate and self-taught, we can rule out formal schooling as the source. His skill was not taught, it was discovered and developed internally. The most likely explanation lies in the intersection of two factors: innate brain structure and intense, continuous, practical application. First, the innate factor. Modern studies of calculating savants suggest a unique neurological wiring, often related to the brain's ability to handle large quantities and spot complex patterns in numerical sequences. Thomas may have simply been born with a brain uniquely predisposed to mathematical abstraction. This would explain the effortlessness and speed he exhibited. The numbers simply made sense to him in a way they don't to most people. They had a physical, undeniable reality. Second, the environmental factor. Ironically, his enslavement. Because he never learned to read or write, he never adopted the conventional, slow methods of pencil and paper arithmetic. His illiteracy forced his mind to devise an entirely internal, memory-based, and highly efficient system. He couldn't rely on external tools, so his brain became the ultimate tool. Furthermore, the very nature of agricultural labor provided a relentless stream of data and complex estimation problems. Every field measured, every crop tallied, every barrel weighted, every day calculated from the last. All of this provided constant, real-world mental practice, shaping his natural gift into a formidable computational skill. This environment was a crucible. It was a life of deprivation that paradoxically created the perfect conditions for his unique talent to flourish, separate from the limitations and conventions of formal education. His genius was forged in the fire of necessity and repetition, leading to a computational method that bypassed the standard, slower neurological pathways used by those who rely on written calculation. He wasn't solving a written equation. He was processing the physical world through a numerical lens, with a speed that still mystifies us 2 centuries later. When Hartshorne and Rush finally finished their rigorous testing of Thomas Fuller, they did something simple and human. They talked to him. They asked him about his life and his thoughts. The record of this conversation is brief, but it offers a profoundly moving glimpse into the man behind the numbers. Thomas expressed satisfaction with the use of his mathematical gift, but his main focus was not on glory or intellectual fame, things he likely couldn't even fully comprehend. Instead, when he spoke, he expressed regret over 2 things. First, he was saddened by the loss of his wife, a deep, human grief that overshadowed any calculation. Second, he expressed a profound regret that his memory, in his old age, was not as sharp as it used to be. The irony here is stunning. This man, who had just performed calculations that dazzled 2 of the nation's leading intellectuals, felt that he was past his prime. He believed his mental processing had slowed down. One telling moment occurred when, during one of the tests, the scholars noticed a slight pause before he delivered an answer. Thomas quickly explained that the pause was due to his age, commenting sadly, "I am not as quick as I was when I was young." The scholars were aghast. His slow calculation had still been performed in a fraction of the time it would have taken them to achieve the same result with their pens and paper. This reveals Thomas Fuller's humility and his dedication to his own internal standard of excellence. He held himself to a benchmark of mental speed that was impossibly high for others, but for him, it was merely the expected speed of his own magnificent machine. His desires were simple: to honor the memory of the woman he loved and to maintain the purity and speed of the one thing that was truly his mind. His story is ultimately a story of quiet dignity, where the greatest human achievement was simply the ability to hold onto an internal life of perfection, even when the external world was defined by imperfection and injustice. Thomas Fuller died in 1790, a year after his famous meeting with the Philadelphia scholars. He passed away still enslaved, a heartbreaking truth that defines the context of his incredible life. His story, however, left behind an intellectual blueprint, a powerful, indelible challenge to the racist assumptions of the era. The historical record acknowledges that Thomas Fuller was a man of extraordinary genius, but the full extent of his contributions will forever remain unknown. How many inventions, how many great mathematical theorems, how many advances in science were lost to the world because his brilliance was confined to a Virginia plantation? We can only calculate the loss in human potential, which is, in itself, an infinite number. His legacy is an affirmation of the principle that human ability is not limited by circumstance, color, or class. It is a mathematical proof of the universal potential that resides in every human being. For the abolitionists of the 18th century, he was a crucial piece of evidence. For us today, He is a reminder that history often hides its greatest figures in the most unexpected places. Thomas Fuller, the enslaved man who became the Virginia calculator, solved the world's complex arithmetic problems effortlessly. But the most profound question he posed, the moral calculation he left for us to solve, was this: if a man who was denied the simplest tools of education could achieve such heights of intellectual power, what justification could there ever be for denying freedom and opportunity to any human being? His silent, lifelong calculation stands as one of the most powerful arguments for human equality ever recorded. 250 years ago, on a quiet plantation in Virginia, the most powerful computer in America walked the fields. It was a human mind, unbound by silicon or wires, a testament to raw, untaught genius. Thomas Fuller's incredible talent forced the educated world to see the enslaved not as property, but as people of unimaginable potential. He died in chains, but his name lives forever in the annals of intellectual history, a silent giant whose numbers shouted a truth louder than any law or doctrine. Genius is free, even when the man is not. Take a moment to consider that amazing fact. How many geniuses are overlooked in our world today, simply because we aren't looking in the right places? If Thomas Fuller's story moved you, please let us know in the comments. Give this video a like, and subscribe for more stories of forgotten figures whose lives changed our understanding of the world. Thank you for listening.